But before we go, Lorenzo, I wanted to trial out a new question that I'm gonna ask all of my guests at the end of the show, which is, what have you changed your mind on recently or ever, and what was it that made you think differently?
Okay, so two things I can nominate. One, I used to be very, very in favor of legalization of narcotics because I really, really hate black markets, and particularly criminal and violent black markets. The way that America has screwed up cannabis legalization has made me rather more cautious on that matter. The other area where I've very much changed my mind in recent years is I've become much, much more aware of the negative and downsides of migration. Now, part of that is I'm Australian. We basically do migration policy way better than almost anyone else in the Western world. Canada, at least recently, was the only one who was close. We have a much, 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 much higher rate of migration as a percentage of population than UK or United States, Western Europe. And it's nowhere near as politically fraught because we do have border control. And I would point out that that's a case of mobilizing public opinion. Because John Howard broke ranks on that and the public were in favour, right? So we've got border control because the Labor Party has learnt that it's got to be in favour of it, otherwise it won't get elected. But because the way we did it was so different from elsewhere, I was not as aware of the downsides that migration could have. Having done a lot more reading and a lot more thinking about how differently it's done elsewhere, I think migration has been a massive bad thing on balance for Western Europe, for the United Kingdom, for the United States, because of the way it's been done. It's not necessarily going to be a bad thing, but because of the way it's done, it's become much, much more disruptive and therefore much more politically fraught than it needs to be. And I'm afraid, very simple view is that in the United States, in Britain and Western Europe, migration policy has been used as an elite weapon against the local working class in the way that's just not true in Australia. Partly because we have preferential voting and compulsory voting, and you can't drive the working class away from the polls. So you have to take their view into consideration because they do turn up and vote because they have to. So the ability to screw over the working class becomes much, much less in that situation. Now, there is still one way we do that, which is our mad land use policies, which mean we drive up rents and housing costs through our migration policy, which is one way we still do screw over our working class. But which also is done in Britain, of course, and also done in Canada, and also done in coastal United States. But the other ways in which you screw up, we don't screw up. And so I've become much, much more aware that migration policy can be done very badly and very destructively. And that's led into, along with my reading into evolutionary means, I've become much less impressed by mainstream economics than I used to be. I have no trouble with markets as such. I have no trouble with commerce as such. I have no trouble with private property as such. So the normal reason why people don't like mainstream economics is they don't like markets, they don't like commerce, they don't like private property. I've got no long problem with any of that. My concern is I've presently come to the conclusion it's just not very good science, that it makes assumptions about people that are just clearly not true. And in particular, analysing migration policy as if migrants are just interchangeable widgets is clearly false. I mean, demonstrably false. And of course, this is a problem that economics has in general, treating people as, at some level, optimizing interchangeable widgets when it's clear that culture matters a lot, for example. And the Glenn Lowry principle, which is relations before transactions, that is, economic transactions are embedded in all sorts of connections, cultural assumptions, and so forth, is true. And mainstream economics does not grapple with the truth of the Lowry principle anywhere near enough. So that's three things, actually. One is I'm less impressed by drug legalization than I used to be. Secondly, I'm much more aware of the downsides of migration policy. I would point out that if you read Robert Fogel's Without Consent or Contract, he analyzes how mass migration fractured the American Republic along the fault line of slavery. So the Civil War is about slavery. No argument. If you read the Confederate Constitution, if you read the secession convention debates, it's about slavery. But mass migration, which occurred because we now had railway and steamships, meant that most of the migrants went to the free states, which pushed up their House of Representative numbers, pushed up their electoral numbers, made it more and more likely they'd have more free states. Right. Meanwhile, it also added people, though far less, to the slave states who weren't committed to the slave system because it was disadvantaging them. And what makes Lincoln the break point is the Republican manifesto. It wasn't that Lincoln was anti-slavery. There'd been anti-slavery presidents before Lincoln. He was not the first anti-slavery president. But the Republican manifesto said we're going to have tariffs and we're going to open out the West to homesteading. Well, that's just catnip to the disillusioned, alienated white males mainly of the South. And the prospect of an alliance between the slaves and the poor white trash, which Lincoln's election presaged, because he could now appoint Republican organizers to all the federal positions in the South, including the postmasters, who allow abolition literature to be spread around, and he can mobilize that people to vote. Right? That was an existential threat to the slave system. So the combination of migration and the slavery, the fractured the United States. And you can see that migration is once again putting the US under enormous pressure. The gap between the metropolitan and the provincial areas, which we can also see in Britain and you can also see in France. That's how to do migration potentially disastrously.
And the third thing was mainstream economics and losing faith in that.
Yeah, and that was connected to all the reading on evolutionary anthropology, but also thinking about this idea about interchangeable widgets. You're analysing migration if you're dealing with interchangeable widgets. That's just rubbish. That's just flatly not true. So for example, there's a thing called the Baumol effect, which is you got increasing productivity here. So the next group round have to bid more for wages. The next group down have to bid more for wages because of the product. So you pull wages up because of the increasing productivity at the top end. So the classic thing is, why are hairdressers paid far more now than they are in 1960? Nothing's changed about hairdressing. It is as productive now as it is in 1960. Well, because productivity at the top end gone up. So you won't get any hairdressers unless you pay them a certain amount. So if you want somebody to cut your hair, you have to pay them that. So they're gone up because you pulled up, right? What if you put a whole lot of people of low skills at the bottom end? You suppress the Baumol effect, right? I've never seen an economist talking about migration to think that through. But why did lower end wages suddenly go up during the pandemic?
Yeah. Because
you stopped importing low skilled people. So low skilled, to get the truck drivers, you had to pay them more, right? You had to pay all these people more. This didn't happen in Australia because the way we do our system, we're not having that effect because the point system leads to a situation where, for example, the migrants are on average slightly more educated than the local people. So we're actually pulling up your capital effect, right? I live in a very high migrant area. It's got one of the highest rates of university education in the country. That's not the British experience of migration. That's not the American experience of migration unless you're in Silicon Valley. It's not the French experience of migration. If you live in a high migrant area, you're not living in a disproportionately high educated area. You're disproportionately the other way around. Using it as a weapon against your working class.